A falling spar killed Horatio Nelson on the deck of HMS Victory before a single broadside was fired at Trafalgar. The morning of October 21, 1805, had begun in light airs and rising swell, with the combined Franco-Spanish fleet of 33 ships strung in a wavering line off Cape Trafalgar and Vice-Admiral Pierre-Charles Villeneuve waiting, against his own better judgment, for the British to come down upon him. Nelson, who had rejoined the fleet off Cadiz on September 28 and circulated his secret memorandum on October 9, intended to break the enemy line in two perpendicular columns and crush the rear before the van could turn. None of that happened. A sudden squall, common enough off the Cape but lethal in its timing, struck Victory's tow-famper as she led the weather column down. The mainmast went over the side in a tangle of cordage and shattered yards, and a length of falling rigging caught the Admiral across the temple as he stood near the binnacle. He was dead before the ship's surgeon could reach him. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. What followed would not be the great annihilation that the Royal Navy had promised itself for a generation. It would be something far more ambiguous, and in the long arithmetic of empire, far more consequential. Vice-Admiral Cuthbert Collingwood, flying his flag in the recently recoppered HMS Royal Sovereign, learned of Nelson's death by signal flag at 1:15. Collingwood was a careful officer, schooled in the fighting instructions that British naval doctrine still formally observed, and the memorandum was Nelson's plan, not his. With Victory wallowing dismasted and the weather column thrown into confusion, he ordered the fleet to form a single line of battle on the larboard tack and engage the combined fleet broadside to broadside in the older fashion. The action that followed was savage but conventional. For 3 hours the lines hammered each other in failing light, gun smoke clinging to the troughs of the swell. 4 French ships of the line and 2 Spanish were taken or driven aground. Perhaps a dozen more were severely damaged. But the main body of Villeneuve's fleet, with Admiral Federico Gravina aboard Príncipe de Asturias still in command of the rear, broke off as the seas rose and clawed northward toward the safety of Cadiz harbour. By dawn on the 22nd, Collingwood held a battered fleet, 6 prizes, and the body of England's most beloved admiral. He did not hold the sea. The dispatches reached London on November 6. They carried 2 truths the Admiralty had no template for handling. Nelson was dead, and the Victory was incomplete. London draped itself in black, but the church bells rang only thinly. William Pitt the Younger, already exhausted and ill, read the news at Bath and is recorded by his secretary as having spoken only one sentence: "We have lost the man and not gained the day." When word of General Mack's surrender at Ulm on October 20th was followed in December by the catastrophe of Austerlitz, the Prime Minister's coalition policy lay in ruins without the consoling counterweight of a decisive sea triumph. Pitt died on January 23, 1806, as he had in our own timeline, but the political settlement that followed was different. The Ministry of All the Talents took office facing a Royal Navy whose prestige had been bruised rather than burnished, and a Lord Barham at the Admiralty who knew the blockade strategy needed rebuilding from its foundations. What no one in Whitehall yet understood was that the equation of European power had quietly shifted in those 3 hours off Cape Trafalgar, and that the consequences would take a decade to reveal themselves. Villeneuve and Gravina brought their surviving ships into Cadiz and Ferrol through the last weeks of 1805 and refitted them under the supervision of French naval engineers dispatched from Toulon and Brest. Napoleon, whose contempt for Villeneuve was a matter of imperial record, found his fleet commander suddenly useful again. By the spring of 1806, the Emperor had issued orders bringing surviving Spanish ships of the line under combined command for Atlantic operations. Manuel Godoy, the Spanish chief minister to King Carlos IV, signed off on the arrangement with reluctance and a careful eye to leverage. The Treaty of San Ildefonso bound Spain to France. The Treaty of Aranjuez had reaffirmed it. But a fleet preserved was a card in the hand, and Godoy intended to play it. For the first time since the 7 Years' War, a serious Bourbon-French naval coalition was reassembling in the Atlantic. The Royal Navy still ruled most of the seas. It no longer ruled all of them. The Berlin Decree of November 21, 1806, issued in the wake of Jenner Auerstedt, established the Continental system on paper. In our own history, the system was an economic instrument with weak naval reinforcement. In this alternate course, Napoleon coupled the customs blockade with sustained surface raiding by squadrons working out of Cadiz, Rochefort, and Toulon. The effect on British commerce was measurable within a year. Convoys to the West Indies suffered losses 2 and 3 times the rates recorded after 1805 in our timeline. Insurance premiums at Lloyd's of London doubled between mid-1806 and the end of 1808. The city absorbed the cost, but it absorbed it grudgingly, and the political pressure on the new ministry to negotiate rather than persist began earlier and bit deeper than Pitt's successors had anticipated. By 1807, Napoleon was preparing the move that, in our history, became the Treaty of Fontainebleau and the joint invasion of Portugal. Here the calculus was different. Spain held a fleet, and Godoy held a brief. When French envoys arrived in Madrid demanding right of passage for an army of 40,000 to march through Spanish territory, the chief minister bargained from a position he had not enjoyed in years. The treaty he negotiated was narrower in scope. Portuguese ports were to be closed to British shipping, but French troops would not be quartered indefinitely on Spanish soil, and Spanish naval bases at Cadiz and Ferrol remained under unambiguous Bourbon control. Napoleon accepted the terms because his attention was already turning eastward, toward Tilsit and the management of Alexander I. The opportunistic dismemberment of the Spanish monarchy that came in 1808 in our timeline did not occur in the same form. The Bourbons, weakened and humiliated, nevertheless remained on the throne in Madrid. The Royal Navy retained general superiority through the long war that followed, but the freedom of action it had enjoyed in our timeline after Trafalgar was gone. British amphibious operations in the Mediterranean were scaled back through 1808 and 1809. The Walcheren expedition was never mounted in recognizable form. Arthur Wellesley's expedition to the Iberian Peninsula, when it finally sailed, was delayed by nearly a year and reduced in scope by half, dispatched not to a Portugal under French occupation, but to a Spain whose government remained nominally allied to Paris and whose ports were closed to him. The Peninsular War, that great drain on Napoleonic strength in our history, became instead a smaller, slower campaign of raids and coastal landings. The French armies that fought in our timeline at Talavera and Salamanca were free to fight elsewhere. The map of Central Europe in 1812 was correspondingly different. The Spanish political crisis of 1810 came regardless. Juntas in Caracas, Buenos Aires, and Mexico City declared autonomy in the name of the captive king, and the long wars of Latin American independence began. But Madrid's response was not the improvised, underfunded set of expeditions that historians of our timeline would catalogue with such grim attention. With its colonial fleet intact and its bargaining leverage in Paris preserved, the Spanish crown dispatched real squadrons and real regiments to the Americas. Bolivar's campaigns in the north and San Martin's crossings in the south stretched across 2 decades rather than one. The wars were longer, bloodier, and ended in a different geography of successor states. Gran Colombia held together longer. The United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata fragmented sooner. Mexico's independence came not in 1821, but in 1829, and on terms that left the northern provinces under Spanish administration for another generation. The map of the Americas that emerged was not the one we know. A spar fell on a quarterdeck, and an admiral died before he could win his battle. Empires are not undone by single accidents, and Britain in this timeline remained powerful, prosperous, and free. But the easy supremacy that the historical Trafalgar purchased for the Royal Navy was never quite paid for here, and the long century that followed bore the marks of a victory that was only ever partial. History keeps its receipts in places we do not always think to look.